This is the Jerusalem Post Zoomcast, JPost One-on-One.
Dr. Gabriel Noah Brahm is a professor of English and World Literature at Northern Michigan University, where he also serves as founding director of the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. In 2018, this center was named an Oasis of Excellence by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Gabe is also a senior researcher fellow at the University of Haifa's Herzl Institute for the Study of Zionism, and the author or editor of numerous books and articles, most recently, the new Blank Slate, published just 2 weeks ago with Claremont Institute's online journal of contemporary thought and opinion, The American Mind. You can follow him on Twitter at Brahm SKI, and you can also, of course, visit his website and learn about what he's doing. So it's really great to have you here today. It's really cool to talk to you. I'm a big admirer of the stuff that you've been writing here. And so I thought I'd just turn it over to you because I know you'd like to kind of introduce this session a bit with a quote and get us thinking about some of the issues that are affecting, American students today. And of course, that's important for us because obviously having an educated American youth and let's say new adults is important, as well as the connection to Israel and Israeli literature. So it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Seth. I'm a fan of yours as well. And you're right. What happens on the American college campus, it's not like Las Vegas. It doesn't stay on the campus. It flows out into the American culture. It's been argued that it even affected the American military in this grotesque debacle in Afghanistan. It affects public opinion with regards to Israel and every other topic. And so that's why I wrote my essay published 2 weeks ago for the American Mind, The New Blank Slate. My intention with that title being meant to emphasize the way in which students are being treated like raw materials, to have indoctrination enforced upon them as if they were a blank slate to be written on rather than human beings. And as luck would have it, I'm not the only one speaking up these days. Barry Weiss, as you know, resigned from the New York Times not long ago. It doesn't happen that often that someone resigns from the New York Times for being harassed by her woke colleagues, for being a liberal feminist with opinions that didn't pass muster with the woke. Well, just the other day, Peter Boghossian resigned in another case similar to that of Barry Weiss from Portland State University. He was a professor of philosophy there. He wrote a letter explaining why he resigned, and he published it. And here's the first paragraph from his resignation, which I'd like just to put out there because I want to support him. I want to echo him. The guts it takes for him to go out there, to put himself out there, and then to let go of a job that most people would love to have. Students, writes Peter Boghossian, are not being taught. Students are not being taught to think. Faculty and administrators have abdicated the university's truth-seeking mission and instead drive intolerance of divergent beliefs and opinions. This has created a culture of offense, where students are now afraid to speak openly and honestly. And he goes on from there. I hope everyone will Google it and read it. Barry Weiss actually published that on her Substack. And again, by coincidence, but not so coincidentally, because these incidents are coming up more and more each day now, it seems, of faculty like myself and Boghossian who've really had enough of woke censorship. And we can get into what that means. Here's a paragraph from my own article, The New Blank Slate, which I'd like to set beside Boghossian's brave letter of resignation. We should start by admitting that as of now, we are not preparing students for citizenship, instructing them in critical thinking, let alone imbuing them with anything like the genuinely liberal outlook that we once aspired to, and which is echoed in the term liberal arts. These days, students are indoctrinated with the manners and mores that their rulers expect of them, while being drilled in rudimentary literacy skills and habits of time management. We offer remedial moral hygiene and psychological orthopedics for the age of the internet, cancel culture, and wokeness über alles. We teach them to wipe their slates clean and keep them that way. Critical race theory, for example, is the latest name for the decades-long disaster unfolding in our schools and its effects on society. Our national reckoning with CRT is fully justified. Either it goes or our education system is sunk. There's a lot in there, and there's more in my article for The American Mind, and there's more in Peter Boghossian's work as well. I just wanted to, and you were kind enough to allow me to kind of frame our discussion today by invoking these citations.
Well, thank you for reading that. I think that I definitely encourage everyone who's listening to this or sees this to go check out the obviously the full piece you've written. I think it's a beautiful piece of writing. It's personal, but it's also I think written with a great zeal for some of the what is almost depicted at kind of barbarians at the gate, trying to rip apart and rip the heart out of, I think, intellectual discovery and those types of things in the academy. I just want to go back and read a bit of the Boghossian piece again, because it was a bit choppy there in the recording, and I just want to go over it again so we're on the same page here. And he says students at Portland State are not being taught to think. Rather, they are being trained to mimic the moral certainty of ideologues. Faculty and administrators have abdicated the university's truth-seeking mission and instead drive intolerance of divergent beliefs and opinions. Now, when I was in school, and I guess you as well, back in a long time back in the day, we were taught this idea of critical thinking, and I also had this inkling at this time, which is like, critical thinking is kind of a stand-in for often kind of self-hatred and bashing Western civilization, and in a sense, what we were doing was not actually particularly original, because if everyone is criticizing the same thing, I mean, then no one is really criticizing it. It's like the famous quote that says, I think, if everyone's thinking the same, then someone's not thinking. So it's a bit of a problem because it's a catch-22. It's like you tell all the students, you must think critically, and so and then all the students parrot back, okay, well, what are we supposed to think? Well, you must hate Western civilization. Well, then I hate it. Yeah, but that's not really critical thinking. The student that raises his hand is like, yeah, but wait, I like Western civilization. And then that person gets thrown out of class. So I think, obviously, as you touch upon, I mean, and you touched along a lot of themes in your article, you talk about how people are not really being taught to read anything that's even really worth reading. So I guess the question I would have to you, having read what you wrote, because I feel like I went through the same period of indoctrination in university. So, they may have been called by different names of whether it's microaggressions or all the different weird things. Now it's CRT or whatever. I mean, doesn't every generation cannibalize the last one? I mean, didn't my parents grew up in the 60s? I mean, they were taught all sorts of rubbish and nonsense as well. And they were also taught that, Western civ sucks. So, I mean, aren't we looking at now 40 years of this? I mean, so, you say in your piece, you're one of a very small minority of, let's say, people that openly identify as say conservative or what have you. I mean, there's probably lots of people that are out there that are quietly closeted, what have you. But I guess, I mean, is it really new what you're describing? I mean, didn't Alan Bloom write about the closing of the American mind? So what are we really talking about now?
This is a great question, Seth, and it is new, and it is old. You're right about these older experiences, these trends that we're familiar with. Most careful observers agree that some of that feeds into what's going on now, but that something changed a few years ago. Anyone who's writing seriously about this, you'll read them or you'll hear them on a podcast, say something changed just a few years ago. People give different explanations for it. There are a number of books out on what it means that we're now teaching the first generation to have grown up always with the internet. That's a part of the explanation. I think undoubtedly it's not the whole explanation. The rise of Donald Trump as a response to political correctness also exacerbated at the same time. It's a dialectic. And really, who knows all the factors that are causing this. But for example, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, when they published their book in 2018, The Coddling of the American Mind, they announced the sense that they had from their data and from their research that something had changed, that students were more fragile, that students were being encouraged to be fragile and trained to be fragile by overprotective administrators, teachers who were rewarding students for expressing sentiments of victimization and who aspired to shield them from harmful thoughts. We never had that before. We had a wave of political correctness in the 90s. I was there for that. You were there for that. This is another wave of political correctness, but it's weaponized now in new ways. The administration is much more sensitive to it and uses it against faculty. If a faculty member gets a complaint from a student, very often some kind of complaint about a microaggression. We never had this term before. The faculty will go into a meeting with HR, with human resources. It's very aggravating. Faculty like Bogosian or me, he's a liberal. I'm one of the very few rare mythical unicorns called conservative on an American college campus. Statistically, we're almost non-existent. If you read studies about Democrat voters versus Republican, or how faculty members donate and administration to political campaigns, there are statistically negligible faculty who identify as conservative and who register as conservative in these studies. I'm one of them, but you don't have to be conservative. You can be a renegade liberal like Bogosian. Something's changed, and it includes a very sensitive administration bureaucracy that's bloated, that uses any hint of a complaint of a microaggression against faculty. I can tell you stories of my own experience. Other faculty have been coming out with them lately as well. Laura Kipnis had some problems that you might have read about. There's a new sensitivity on the part of students. There's a new vicious aggressiveness on the part of younger faculty and administration who don't protect faculty, but to the contrary, will go in for the kill and harass faculty who get complaints from students and maybe from their peers, fellow faculty, who see them as simply stating ideas that others don't want to hear. This is something new. The idea that speech is violence, that unwanted thoughts or ideas are harmful to people who have to be protected from them. My own campus was listed as one of the 10 worst for free speech in 2017. We're not Princeton, we're not Berkeley, we're not Yale. And yet we were listed for good reason as one of the 10 worst in 2017. So don't let anyone tell you that it's just the Ivy Leagues that are full of this kind of highfalutin political correctness we call wokeness. It's all over the place. And not only were we listed as one of the 10 worst, but in 2018, when Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt published The Coddling of the American Mind, we were singled out for discussion as a campus where free speech was not respected, wokeness was out of control, and they even said that the adjective they used was callousness on the part of administration who practiced what they called administrative overkill, productive of cognitive distortions among students. So this is what I'm trying to stress is new here in response to your question. We've had the growth of the bureaucracy on my campus, like many campuses. We have a new diversity, equity, and inclusion officer we never had before. We have various initiatives now going on my campus to solicit complaints along the lines of DEI, or as I think it should be called DIE, because it spells the death of cognitive liberty and of academic freedom. Again, my campus was judged to be guilty of administrative overkill in a callous way, producing among students in this sort of sanitized language cognitive distortions. What it means is that this network of constraints on what you can and can't say is driving kids nuts, and faculty as well.
Well, it's definitely driving them nuts. When I read what you had to say and listened to what you're talking about, you talk about an alliance of politically correct faculty, administration, and corporations. And I think, that touches on something that a lot of us have felt, that the quiet behind the scenes alliance that probably seems to exist somehow in big tech, social media, and also some major media, let's say, as well as the education system. It sounds a lot more like a kind of totalitarian agenda, which is a la, let's say, the Cultural Revolution in China, or the concepts that were put forth about, let's say, under the Soviet Union, about the nature of education in itself, which is actually social engineering, right? I mean, the tillers of men's souls or whatever. I mean, this is a very different concept of what is education, what's the purpose of it, right? Which is that it's not really there to educate you as much as it's there to teach you what to think and how to say things correctly, and to make you, you talk about cyborgs in your piece a bit. Well, I mean, in some, let's say, some dystopian novels, or even maybe what actually happened in the Soviet Union or under fascism, I mean, the goal is to create cyborgs. I mean, the goal actually is not to have a bunch of people in a classroom who all think differently. Why would you want them? I mean, it's preferable to have them all say the same thing kind of correctly, and then go on to do the right thing, in their view, the right thing, in the newsroom or in a corporation or in government or service. And that's another model for society. I mean, it's a lot more like this is the model we might think of as a society in which church and state are one, in which all people are trained for the priesthood. As opposed to, let's say, the tradition of, you mentioned in your article, Tocqueville or whatever, what makes America interesting. I don't want to say what makes America great again, but let's say what makes America interesting. Because even under a right-wing Trump worldview, I think most of us would probably not want to live under just listening to him all day either. You have to, as a critical thinker, you'd have to challenge that as well. So, but what makes a country interesting is the diversity of thought that leads to innovation, which leads to competition, hopefully, as opposed to, I think, what you sketch out is that people are kind of led to think a certain way. They may not even really agree with it, but they kind of just go along, most of them, because I think they just feel like, okay, that's how I get a good grade. I'll just do that. Okay, I'll just parrot it back. I mean, in your view, and we've heard this for a while, that there's a decline in humanities and that there's a huge crisis in higher education. That's not a secret. Okay, so then I guess the question is, so what? I mean, so what comes next? I mean, I think even Vladimir Lenin said, "Что делать?" What next? I mean, what will we do about it? I mean, I think that there are some people that are just leaving, Barry Weiss, they're just opting out and saying, okay, I'm not going to be a member of the Legacy Media Club. I'm going to do my own thing. And Boghossian, I don't know what he'll end up doing, but I mean, some people are just opting to leave. What do you think?
I think that I am going to stand and fight. I respect and I applaud Barry Weiss. I respect and I applaud Peter Boghossian. And I can understand if I were in their shoes, I would leave too. Peter didn't have the luxury of tenure. I don't want to incur all the wrath of your viewers who may think that a tenured faculty like me doesn't have any business complaining, but they can still make my life miserable. If I have to answer to HR once a year, even, or once a semester, it drags out for the whole year. And I've had crazy complaints that I've had to deal with, which I could tell you about if you're interested. It's a part of their
We
strategy.
don't have enough time.
We don't have time for that. Yeah. I taught Sophocles Oedipus Rex, and I was accused of supporting incest. I'm not making this up, Seth. I had to get FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. I had to get the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law to consult. I had to speak to a former AAUP national president. FIRE wrote a letter on my behalf in the end to suppress this action against me for this horrible advocacy of incest that I was accused of by a student who couldn't tell the difference between my views and what Freud said about what Sophocles said. This would be as if I taught the Communist Manifesto, which I have for years, and somebody said, well, Professor Brahm advocates violent overthrow of the government. Well, be that as it may. No, I don't advocate violent overthrow of the government. Marx does, and I teach about Marx. This is something that is making professors' lives very difficult if we even assign texts that advocate for things that students should think about. I agreed in that negotiation, that threat to me, that Star Chamber, that I would remove Camille Paglia from my syllabus from now on. And I feel a bit bad about that, but that was kind of the compromise we came to. I think I might have lost the thread of your excellent question just now. You're pointing the end. Oh, it was no. I remembered. I'm not so senile. I want to say very clearly, because you asked a question that I welcome. I admire anyone who breaks out and leaves the academy. Jordan Peterson is still, I think, an academic, but he's gone outside as well to do his work. I'm going to stay and fight as long as I can. Until and unless I'm thrown out, I'm going to continue to teach students the way I was taught, which was that provocation is our job. The Socratic method is our method. We confront students with thoughts they may not want to deal with. I started an organization, thecaif.org, the CAIF, the CAIF.org, the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. That's the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom. I started this about 3 or 4 years ago to answer your question as my reply to the cancel culture. I brought in authors and intellectuals, writers, speakers that would never make it onto a college syllabus. I brought Mark Lilla, Patrick Deneen, Deirdre McCloskey, Greg Lukianoff, Arthur Millick. Mark Lilla wrote a best-selling book. It can't be discussed on most American campuses unless you make a very, very special effort, as I've done, to found a center. I raised tens of thousands of dollars of outside money. I got a lot of resistance and some support. I want to stress we have some very good people on my campus that I'm deeply grateful for. I won't mention them because I don't want to get them in trouble. So they're besieged as well. But I brought Lilla to answer you as to what I'm doing. Mark Lilla, The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics, was a best-selling book. We had a huge turnout. Somebody told me afterward that they didn't see any of the gender studies people there. I would have never known, Seth, because that was not in my mind. I was excited to meet one of my intellectual heroes, a great liberal writer. I happen to be conservative by nature. He's a liberal. We had a nice dinner. We had a nice talk. Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed, a Catholic conservative. I'm a Jewish conservative, so we overlap a little. Deirdre McCloskey wrote a book, Why Liberalism Works. You see what I'm saying? I brought her the next time to respond to Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed. That's my approach. And I've brought other speakers, and we've had a great turnout, and students have been inspired. At the same time, somebody pointed out to me that our critics seem to have just boycotted or stayed away. I had hoped they might have shown up to have a conversation, but their model of academia seems to be, we say one thing, you say another if you dare. We try to punish you and exclude you and so forth. There's very little dialogue. I'm trying to promote it.
I understand. I have a question. I mean, then Joe, just very shortly, briefly, because we do have to.
I'll speak more concisely now.
It's not a problem.
It's the lightning round.
This is a lightning round. You just yes or no answers.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, what you're sketching is you've touched on a lot of different problems, a lot of different issues. A lot of this obviously affects the Western education systems, particularly the United States, I think. What is it? What do you think it means for Israel? I mean, you mentioned trying to bring in Israeli authors into your classroom, or mention the word Zionism, which I assume in some American classroom, is like, is akin to mentioning, like Voldemort or whatever, and then you're taken away or something. So, I mean, what do you think the long-term implications are for Israel? I mean, even when I was on college campus, I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, there were anti-Israel groups as well. I mean, that's not new. I mean, the 60s, Israel was Zionism was defined as racism by the UN in the 70s. So again, we're not dealing with a particularly new phenomenon, but perhaps a new iteration of the degree to which, would Israeli authors just be totally forbidden, or how does it work? I mean, so can you give me a sense of what it might mean for the Israel-American diaspora Israeli Jewish, let's say, connection? And briefly.
I'll be as brief as a Jewish intellectual can be. The difference from the 90s to now is they're trying literally to censor us. Back then, they wanted to say bad things, and we could respond. Now it's BDS, it's boycott, divestment, and sanction. It's you shouldn't be allowed to participate. And that model of non-engagement, non-recognition, refusal of normalization that we're familiar with in the Middle East has become dominant on American college campuses. They don't want to talk to you anymore, Seth. That's the difference. I brought Benny Morris, the leading historian of the Middle East conflict, to my campus in northern Michigan. And there was a whisper campaign that students, on the part of faculty, telling students to stay away from the most interesting historian of the Middle East conflict that we have, the authoritative historian on the Nakba, on the dispossession of Palestinians. There was a campaign on the part of faculty to discourage students from attending. And that was frankly a bit disheartening. We still had a good turnout, but we could have had a better turnout. The problem for Israel now is that Israel is considered to be the un-PC nation, and Zionism might as well be well, it's a kind of taboo on American college campuses. It boils down to the fact that Jewish students and supporters of Israel will be intimidated if they let themselves be intimidated, marginalized, and dispossessed from conversation. Israel's considered to be the outpost of Western white imperialism. Israelis are considered white, which comes as a surprise to you, perhaps, and perhaps to your wife as well, and to many Israelis. This is the problem. CRT, critical race theory, defines everyone as white or a person of color, oppressor or oppressed, and Israel is defined as the nation of oppressors over and against Palestinians who are considered people of color. The difference, to be brief, is that the movement is not to speak to Zionist bigots anymore, but to try to get us to shut up, to go away, maybe to quit or to be fired from our posts.
Okay. Let me ask you though, don't you think, do you think perhaps, like a lot of things in history is a series of waves, they tend to go too far, like the Inquisition, or I don't know, the communism, whatever. Usually these things go too far and then they decline. Do you think that perhaps we'll see and this will be an overreach attempt? In the past we had weird things in America like new math, where they weren't going to teach math or whatever, and then I remember they even had that weird controversy in the 90s about Ebonics. Let's teach people to speak Ebonics. And then there was a huge pushback, and they said, well, no, you can't really do that. Even with bilingual education, for instance, they used to try to teach that. for younger kids. And then, of course, everyone realized, well, isn't that just a great way to teach people not to speak English? And then they just kind of can't ever get jobs in America. And then isn't that kind of a nice way to keep them as cleaners and undocumented? So rich people have servants. I mean, there's a lot of weird things that happen in the education system. And often there is a slow attempt to correct the course of the oil tanker back to kind of not running into the shoals and leaking all the oil and sinking. So but very briefly, do you think these people, this kind of totalitarianism in education will overreach? And of course, there will be victims, along the way, but eventually it will go too far and there will be a correction back to kind of some normality, and kind of actually, let's teach some Western authors again. Not everyone can be an expert on Chinese civilization in their English language composition class or whatever.
I hope that it will correct itself, Seth, but I can't honestly tell you that I think it will. Arthur Millick at the Heritage Foundation wrote an essay everyone should read called Preventing Suicide by Higher Education. He claims that higher education has become a threat to the well-being of the country as a whole, because that's where we train our future leaders, and that it can only be defunded. We have to defund the thought police, is his notion. My former teacher, John Ellis, just published a book, John M. Ellis, and John fought to reform the university since the 90s, back around the time I was his student. He's come to the conclusion, a better man than I, that they're unreformable and that we have to defund the thought police. The problem is that so many tenured faculty are extreme leftists or leftists, anti-American, hostile to men and to whites and to Israelis and to Western civilization at large, people for whom it's important to remain as angry as possible, as Richard Rorty, the social democratic philosopher, once said about people whose whole life is invested in identity politics. They're not letting go. They're in tenured positions. They won't hire anyone who disagrees with them. They make our lives miserable if we do manage to get hired and to get tenure. And for example, in my department, briefly, we just went through a whole series of hires. We got a new department head, a proud non-binary person, and we got 6 radical feminists in place of the old guard who were incentivized to retire, incentivized with carrots and sticks. We used to have a Russian novel specialist, a Victorianist, somebody interested in Faulkner and Henry Adams. We had a person specializing in the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Blake, Coleridge. I was hired to teach literary theory. I can no longer teach literary theory to the grad students they admit now, who are strictly admitted on the basis of identity politics. So I withdrew from that role. We hired 6 people in a row specializing in Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Donna Haraway's notion of feminist cyborgs that you mentioned earlier. In other words, I'd love to say things come and go. Things will get better. We're fighting back and we're optimistic. We are fighting back, but I'm not optimistic. The best thinkers on this topic are clear-sighted, and they claim that it's the university system as we know it that has to go.
Well, that's unfortunate. I mean, it sounds depressing. We'll have to have you back on this, and we'll have to do another one of these. There's a lot to cover. I mean, I think what you need to do in order to subvert that is just propose a course of literary theory of illiterate civilizations to go really deep into it. I mean, or future literary theory from the future, and then you can just make up whatever you want. Listen, it is depressing. I hope it will get better. I want to remind the viewers that the place to find his essay here is AmericanMind.org. And the name of it is The New Blank Slate by Gabriel Noah Brahm. Brahm is spelled B-R-A-H-M. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I could do this a million times.
All right, take care.